From Uniting the Cults and History Flights Productions. It's The Hidden Faith, a truly independent investigation of the Baha'i Faith. This time, though, alongside my co hosts, cannabis and religion researcher Chris Bennett and head moderator of the RX Baha'i subreddit, Dale Husband, the Honorable Skeptic, I'll be primarily examining the Fatimiyya Sufi order, a charismatic ayahuasca, DMT, and Halma fueled cult. Though that's not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, as Chris Bennett will point out, Wahid has multiple misunderstandings of the history of these drugs. Consisting of a dozen people based in Australia and founded by Grand Sheikh Nia Wahid Azal, in order to compare its tactics such as perpetual victimhood and online harassment to that of the shadowy Baha'i Internet Agency, minority guardianist Baha'is, and the separately defined power cult of the Universal House of Justice. So why should people care? Deluded old men claim that liberal, scientifically based reasoning itself, as constituted post Enlightenment, is wrong and call themselves representatives of God despite benefiting from the intellectual freedom liberalism provides all the time. That liberalism is not exclusive to Europeans either, despite Wahid's attempts to frame skepticism of his divine revelation and well founded criticism of Hamas's tactics as a white supremacist concept. After all, the American and French revolutions of 1776 and 1789 inspired the Haitian one in 1804, and the struggle for European freedom in World War II was primarily fought with colonized bodies that then gained their country's freedom. To name just a few examples of dozens that show that good ideas like rational rejection of all unfalsifiable claims have no border. Let's see. Just going to be cleaning some dirt off, metaphorically and literally, from me, because this man has decided to make me his mission for some reason. And, well, this is going to be my final takedown of him once and for all. This man should not have any platforms on the internet, and I will explain why very shortly. So, another example is that the third leader of the Pies, and depending on who you ask, first or only guardian, Shogi Effendi, who was Oxford educated, did exactly that, including expelling his entire family, declaring homosexuality a mental handicap, despite likely being a self-loathing gay man. Oh, and I just had the volume wheel down. But anyway, and sniffing at his cousin for marrying a quote low-born Christian girl. The reason why you should care is that despite Wahid Azal's dismissal of my using these words as colonialism for reasons, Wahid is a delusional sociopath who loves to threaten people in similar ways to that. Not very godly, if you ask me, and thinks he can bring the wrath of God, or rather the police and online platforms, upon anyone, paralleling the tactics of a certain mafioso president who just said that Democrats should enjoy their last Merry Christmas. So, Wahid, I defeated God by casting that old asshole out when my cousin died on 9/11. I defeated him again in the parking lot of American University in freshman year of college after my relationship with someone from the Baha'i faith was my final time giving the creaky concept of monotheism a chance. And I have made peace with the atheist accepting all loving God concepts that my wonderful Christian fiance and son in Eswatini, Africa believe in, and that help shape their unconditional love for me. But certainly not your grievance-fueled, wrathful God, Wahid. If you truly are God, I will defeat you once and for all, here and now, for a third and final time. History does not forget, and this channel does stand for truth, justice, and historical accuracy as the wrath of history. You can make whatever shitty ranting response you want to this, but after this, leave me the fuck alone, okay? The good news is, Wahid, that you also played right into my trap by attacking me without a logical basis and became free content, which is the way to handle any trolls, in my opinion. Even crazed wannabe messiah trolls. Uh, Perhaps God does exist, and him being an angry, bitter, harassing hermit out of touch with the modern world would explain a lot about how fucked we are as a species right now. God or not, let's begin with Wahid's pathetic response to a portion of my last Hidden Faith script about him entitled, in all caps, for the volume of your post title clearly strengthens your argument. The incoherence of my critics, an analysis of DC Shepard's Substack post as moral performance, liberal paternalism, and logical collapse. It starts out DC Shepard is precisely the kind of textbook white liberal racist that I recently wrote about in the first chapter of The Wretched of the Corporate State. He is also an opportunist and time waster from hell. Apparently, my trolling comment on his posts that he deleted in a couple of paragraphs in a 2-hour-long video calling him out for supporting the murder of innocent civilians, including on October 7th, and calling the Bondi Beach shooting an inside job, was enough to get him angry with me. He's doing this to protect Muslims from any criticism whatsoever. And I'm unfortunately blocked from his Substack, so I can't really verify a lot of this, but some of it is on his blog post, which is on his blogspot, excuse me, which is linked throughout. And cannot have me blocked, so that's great. Anyway, so regardless, this is precisely the dehumanizing behavior that I condemned both sides of the Israel-Palestine conflict for perpetuating in the last episode of The Hidden Faith. All that was enough to launch 4,000 words of barely cogent, pseudo-intellectual diatribe, to which I will respond with nearly 6,000 in this actual essay of research and actual original thought. Apparently, Wahid, you're just that unemployed that you can write multiple book-length screeds hardly anyone reads, attacking everyone you can think of, and imagine as part of some worldwide conspiracy against you personally that you've gone to the UN about for some reason. So, yeah. So with that misspelling, he called me an opportunist with nothing but bald assertion. We agreed to work together to take down Justin You're only saying that I'm an opportunist now because, like Chris Bennett said on his latest post of a lengthy 3-part Substack expose that we'll go over in great detail on the podcast portion, you are the opportunist who conned me into liking you and who has a habit of viciously turning on anyone who offers the slightest criticism. I gotta grab this with superhuman strength and put it over here. There we go. That'll be a lot easier reaching that bottom part. Anyway, it's nice to have a calm game like this when I'm talking about subjects that make me angry because this guy just picks me off. But anyway, you also called me a racist, Wahid, with no evidence other than that white people who you think are incorrect can never say anything you don't like. When I never invoked your Iranian identity as a criticism of you. Ever. Doing so to me is in itself a racist twisting of postmodern critical race theory by inappropriately pitting it against liberalism. In general, a common theme of his, without acknowledging divisions such as neoliberalism and democratic socialism, which I personally subscribe to for your personal gain. You also misgendered me again by pretending to, quote, not negate DC Shepard's trans identity or experiences to cover your ass while repeatedly using the raw pronouns for me. They, them, theirs, by the way, in case you weren't listening, asshole. And using your race, Iranian, a culturally appropriated and DMT-infused faith when the Bionic website never acknowledges you as, to quote him, as a kind of moral inoculation, a guarantee of progressive legitimacy that preempts critique. That's why I called him a moron. Not because he's Iranian, but because he doesn't understand basic argumentation and human decency, and constantly uses the tu quoque fallacy, or entirely appealing to the speaker's hypocrisy without supporting evidence. I'm not engaging in the same fallacy because I have evidence of your hypocrisy, not innuendo. To continue with this screed, that aside, his Substack post under examination presents itself as a principled intervention in debates surrounding the Baha'i faith, Israel, Palestine, and online harassment. Right, forgot that this is how you're supposed to do that. Anyway, it's been a minute since I played Power Wash Simulator 2, so gotta get back to that in the new year. Anyway, Um, yeah, okay. In practice, however, Wahid continues, it functions less as an analysis and more than as a moral performance. Excuse me. One that relies on narrative authority, selective quotation, and the conflation of personal grievance with political critique. The author repeatedly claims allegiance to truth, justice, and historical accuracy, yet the text consistently substitutes these claims with affective escalation, ad hominem framing, and an assumption that moral certitude can be asserted through tone rather than demonstrated through argument. At the structural level, much like Chris Bennett's butthurt ramblings, the post is incoherent. It denounces harassment while engaging it. It rejects ad hominem attacks while centering its narrative on character judgments. It claims neutrality while demanding allegiance to its own interpretive frame. The repeated insistence that critics are morons, deluded, or in need of mental health intervention is not coincidental. Or so Wahid says. Um, it, it, it is the primary argumentative engine. Disagreement is never treated as a difference in evidence, methodology, or interpretation, but as pathology or malice. This move forecloses debate while allowing the author to posture as the sole adult in the room. The A classic feature of what might be called performative liberal rationalism, the belief that one's position is self evidently reasonable, and that dissent must therefore be irrational, extremist, or dangerous. I couldn't have said anything better about you myself, Wahid. Again, the distinction between calling a critic deluded from making a moronic argument and calling someone yeah, um, and a moron for making a moronic argument, too. And calling someone a moron for some immutable protected characteristic is, again, I never attached your ethnicity to anything and have evidence of your insane ramblings against Jews while you repeatedly dismiss me as a white liberal with zero evidence of malfeasance. You basically yelled into a mirror about your own flaws and pretended that it was me. I'll call your belief in your own righteousness performative Abrahamic mystic supremacism. The claim that you have direct insight from your God, obsessed with patrilineal prophetic succession for some reason, and therefore you're above everybody else. Geronimo! Oh, not quite. Geronimo! Anyway, had to be silly there for a second. So I'm almost done, but I'm still trying to find the last little bits of dirt here. And that's what I'm doing with my own conscience by cleaning the last little bits of dirt and anger that I feel towards Wahid Azal. This man has been clinging to the dirty underside of the internet for 30 years, harassing anyone he likes, and I am sick of it and want him gone from the internet. Period. So, the problem is that insights from God are inherently unfalsifiable because he's never conveniently available to answer direct public questions. And therefore, someone claiming infallible authority from God or claiming to be God, from the Pope to the Baha'i Universal House of Justice to yourself, can never be held accountable. Europe learned this the hard way during the 30 Years' War, which up until that point was one of the most brutal and wide-ranging wars in the continent's history since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And Enlightenment thought largely sprouted up in that time period because, quote, post-war conditions were highly favorable to new ways of thinking and doing things, building on Greco-Roman rationalism rediscovered during the Renaissance. After the fall of the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire, reintroduced these ideas when its scholars fled the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks, and the printing press made them widely available. Anyway, you posture yourself, Wahid Azal, as the next manifestation of God, an affliction you share with the Bab and Baha'u'llah multiple times throughout your boring, rambling videos, while acting far more viciously towards me than Jesus Christ or Buddha or many other religious figures that have been claimed to be God would probably approve of. You do the same towards your political opponents in the hyphen Baha'i faith with threats of death, which are not new for you, by, quote, skull fucking in a since deleted post on Reddit until they, quote, moan into the Aha kingdom, culturally appropriate an entire religion, Azali Babism, aka the Bayani faith, that is so quiet they don't care or can't object, and then act like a know-it-all. I guess God is just a slob like one of us after all, with sloppy logic and violent temper. This posture, he continues, is reinforced by the post's handling of private communications. The selective publication of chat logs, explicitly acknowledged as partial, quote, what I was able to save, is presented as transparency, while simultaneously accusing the other party of bad faith and manipulation. This is a textbook example of narrative asymmetry. The author controls the archive, controls the framing, and then imputes intent, obfuscation, fear of retaliation as fact. The result is not evidence, but insinuation. In analytical terms, this collapses the distinction between documentation and storytelling, weaponizing intimacy and context stripping to produce reputational harm under the banner of accountability. Weaponizing intimacy? Where do you get these combinations of words? Idiot. But anyway, the sanctity of private communications should only be broken under grave circumstances. Your threatening of me was one of them. You were the one who deleted your messages, not me, as it is physically impossible for someone to delete someone else's messages on Reddit. Far from your claims of ill intent, I tried very hard for months after the death threats to bend over backwards to keep you comfortable and not angry with me until I simply couldn't take your insidious behavior anymore. You can't delete what you said to avoid accountability for doubling down on threatening your Baha'i opponents with death, which is not something new to you, as documented in the script, and uh, is a very serious accusation indeed. So I needed evidence for such and protection from retaliation. And then say that I'm the one selectively cloning. I handled it this way in the first place to prove that you are the one framing the narrative, not me, which proof undermines any claim to fairness or intellectual honesty on your part. I also did it to prove that you actually did say those death threats and threatened to attack me and falsely use reporting systems on YouTube like you did to Dale Husband. If you ever ran to YouTube like the whiner you are, because you ultimately have no argument but calling the police on your opponents. Unfortunately, my picture was very incomplete at first, but then I accidentally rediscovered the messages you deleted in a different screen-recorded archive, and now you can't hide what you've done. There is a difference between critique and sermon. Critique dissects, weighs, and demonstrates. Sermons declaim, condemn, and demand assent. The text under review claims to be the former and says mine is the latter in an endless bleeding of tout pourquoi, but is unmistakably the latter. A performance of certainty masquerading as analysis, a polemic that mistakes insult for evidence, violence for action, and theory for truth. For instance, invectives like white liberal racist and time waster from hell are not critique but character assassination, especially since you have wasted more than enough of my and everyone else's time already. Yet I need to expel you once and for all from my time with this last removal of your argumentative constipation from my system. Next time you respond, you can pretend to have the last word while I just say lol and move on with my life, with my fiance, with my son, with History Flights Productions, which has brought far more value to political, religious, and gaming news conversations than you ever will. To open with an ad hominem is to admit that evidence alone cannot carry the weight. You condemn me for collapsing debate into moral certainty, yet I bring multiple linked sources throughout my script, while yours collapses its own critique into insult before the conversation even begins. The text rails against hypocrisy, but the critique is really the same. It pathologizes dissent, ridicules tone, and reduces disagreement to malice, when I did not do the same. Unless I had the evidence that was clear for all to see, such as your death threats and the trolling Baha'i insinuating I was so embittered by my divorce from an emotionally abusive Baha'i woman that I would commit domestic terrorism against Baha'is. To condemn ad hominem argumentation while practicing it is not analysis. It is hypocrisy dressed up as theory. But that's been your modus operandi your entire life, Wahid. Refuse to apologize and double and triple down on like the privileged pretend scholar you are. While I have a record, many times, of correcting myself when proven wrong, and as often demonstrated in comments left on my videos, and do not claim academic authority for myself. My attackers are always white men, even if I was a white man and not a non-binary person. Our anecdote inflated into universal truth. You are not immune to criticism just because I'm an American and you're Iranian. And personal encounters do not constitute sociological law. to generalize from a handful of experiences to a sweeping racial axiom. It is sloppy reasoning at best, racial essentialism at worst. It is the very reductionism this essay claims to resist. The essay insists my post is racist because it enacts paternalism, and paternalism is racist because it enacts authority, without a strong disapproval of the logos and ethos of my essay instead of just the pathos. This is mere not tautology, not logic. The conclusion is smuggled into the premise in every paragraph. The argument chases its own tail, mistaking repetition and highfalutin buzzwords for intellectual rigor. Alleged tone policing and seemingly dismissive rhetoric are equated with colonial domination and systemic racism in rhetorical inflation. Not every interpersonal slight is the Nakba. Collapsing all harms into one category is dishonest, a cheap trick to make minor grievances look like world historical oppression. The racial contract framework is wielded like a hammer. Every counterexample is reabsorbed as proof of the system. This makes the claim unfalsifiable, as I experienced in a similar incident last year. While I'm not claiming I've ever acted perfectly, it is if something is immune to contradictory evidence so blithely dismissed as a tool of the West, it is immune to challenge. At that point, it is not an argument but an intellectually dishonest recitation of creed. Mills, Massad, and Fanon are all authors invoked like prophets, yet instead of applying their ideas rigorously, as we'll discuss in more detail, the text waves them around with almost scriptural rhetorical authority to belittle my positions and dismiss the strawman of Wahid Azal's own construction. While these authors are important to study for anyone seriously deconstructing Western-dominated archetypes, your use of them to flatly dismiss my perspective entirely is bare name-dropping, because it doesn't acknowledge criticisms of them that may present flaws in your arguments. This is especially troubling, Wahid, when you repeatedly refuse to acknowledge that I criticized America and Israel's actions multiple times in my original script alongside Hamas's and the Baha'i faiths. Anyway, these criticisms include Mills reducing the agency of non-white people under the totalizing maxim of the racial contract, in capital letters. Massad's reduction of gendered and sexual liberation movements in the Arabic-speaking world to mere products, agents, or informants of Western imperialism. And his presumption to make such assertions without having engaged directly with the activists where history is concerned, whilst taking speaking engagements at the controversial American University in Cairo. And Hannah Arendt's criticism of Fanon's theory of violence as a justified tool of liberation in The Wretched of the Earth, shaped by his war experiences, when she stated in On Violence in 1969, quote, "Violence is ruled by means and reasoning. The most probable change it will bring about is the change to a more violent world." Fanon's example is particularly interesting to me because I just watched the kind of overrated but still very fun movie, One Battle After Another, the day after Christmas. I liked the movie alright, mainly due to the excellent action scenes and the nuanced and believable performances coming from Leonardo DiCaprio, Sean Penn, and Benicio del Toro. However, after Licorice Pizza frustrated me in 2021, I came prepared for Paul Thomas Andersonism, such as broad strokes handling of serious themes, for mostly other than the what time is it scenes. Inept comedy that undercuts the sloppily handled and hammered in messages, while OBAA's marginalized characters are often treated as the butt of the joke. Shayna McHale is directed to play Jungle Pussy. Yes, that's her real name in the movie. Spoilers from here on out for One Battle After Another. You've been warned. As a walking cliche, spouting what people who half remembered blaxploitation films, not a dunk on that classic genre of film. I got the Blu-ray of Shaft from Criterion Collection years and years ago, and plan to watch it once I get back home in early January. From college. Think aren't black women should sound like. Teyana Taylor is better as Perfidia Beverly Hills. I swear, who was actually paid to come up with these names? And is the catalyst for the film's plot, but is yet another strong black woman archetype gains her power from acting as a Jezebel towards DiCaprio and Penn. According to the excellent Substack academic Hadassah Race, this is one of the many, quote, controlling images used to, quote, justify exploitation, regulate sexuality, and silence resistance, unquote. Being completely undefined by anything but her sexuality via a stereotype rooted in slavery and rape. Reduces Perfidia to a prop to make Anderson feel like he's an avant-garde director. Just like Wahid uses a hollow solidarity with Palestinians as a prop for his egotistical assumption of the mantle of revolutionary struggle. Chase Infinity is superb as Perfidia's daughter Willa, but is even more of a plot MacGuffin than her mother somehow. The question of her parentage takes up so much of the movie's oxygen and so much of her agency that it smothers the rather silly, ill explained, yet on the nose world build. The evil government faction that parodies MAGA, it worships Santa Claus and opposes race mixing because hard fascists are stupid. True, they are, but the Christmas adventurers seats dragged because the belaboring of this one plot point with wooden acting bothered the shit out of my autistic instinct that demands villains have gravitas or internal logic to add nuance to theme, even if people like Wahid are unlikely to have such in real life. Maybe this will be funnier once Trump is gone as well. Finally, we get to Bobo. A fun coincidence, given that that's my Swazi fiance's nickname I have permission to use on air. Uh, and unlike her, is white and non-binary. For the only representation non-binary people get in this film, Bobo cracks in two scenes under interrogation. The only ones, if I recall correctly, where they have any important dialogue, and is the one to give up Willa's secret phone number to the goons. That's incredibly frustrating to me as I've done my best to quietly resist this current American stupidity while non-binary, and yet haven't been able to quit my job at Consumer Financial Protection Bureau while they've been trying to illegally terminate me, illegally destroyed my disability employee resource group, and last but certainly not least, are illegally refusing to request funding from the Federal Reserve, making supporting, let alone traveling to see my family in Africa an ongoing concern. We're far stronger as gender variant people than either Paul Thomas or Anderson or Wahid Azal give us credit, since we've existed for thousands of years in practically every society on Earth. Yet I'm not surprised Paul Thomas Anderson didn't do his homework here, just as Wahid didn't when he hoped to have my supposed white maleness to shadowbox him and eat it too, by claiming to not be minimizing my trans identity. This is the same way Anderson didn't even attempt to address the real life harms of a 25-year-old girl taking a 15-year-old boy when directing Licorice Pizza. Or Wahid couldn't conceive that threatening violence to political opponents online is not only wrong, but counterproductive. When you're that wrapped up in ego, you gain blinders. Anderson just cannot handle nuanced characterization for anyone but middle-aged white guys, just as Wahid apparently cannot conceive of intellectual depth for anyone but himself on the internet. I bring this movie up because the name of the American Resistance Group in OBBA OBAA, excuse me, I typed that wrong in the script. Let me fix that. French 70 called the French 75 um is a deliberate reference to the same Algerian War of Independence from 1954 to 1962 that Fanon, then dying of leukemia, recounted his participation into his wife in 1961, with another reference being Leonardo DiCaprio's character watching Gilo Pontecorvo. I'm sorry if I butchered that to Italy. And his watching Pontecorvo's 1966 masterpiece docudrama, The Battle of Algiers, which is available for free on YouTube and will be linked in the description and script. Well in Italian with English and Spanish subtitles, as well as HBO Max. On television, I'll have my full thoughts on the latter for the unscripted podcast portion of the video along with Shaft. However, from what I've read, the film shows a very accurate portrayal of the conflict and has been praised as an influence on films from 1984's Red Dawn and subsequently Ukrainian resistance during the 2022 war, to 2006's Children of Men, whose director Alfonso Cuarón said, "The first time I saw this, I swore they were lying when they said everything was fiction." This is a very different, more historically grounded approach to portraying revolutionary conflict on film in my hypothesis than either Fanon takes when stating such heated generalisms as, quote, liberation from colonialism can only be a violent phenomenon that, quote, reeks of red hot cannonballs and bloody knives, and, quote, during the struggle for liberation, this artificial sentinel, the Western morality, is smashed to smithereens. In the face of contravening evidence for the utility of nonviolent struggle in overthrowing authoritarianism, colonial and not, such as the Arab Spring of 2011 and the Gen Z revolution in Nepal. Though Fanon doesn't call even Fanon doesn't call violence an unrestrained good in the article that I cited, or that OBAA takes when mocking rather than explaining the Christmas adventures. To conclude this tangent about the film, I believe that sprawling theories of discursive legitimation, while useful to explain broad political trends, such as Marx with his theory of the alienation of labor that has resonated with me, tend to be shattered into multiple different theories upon contact with actual history, unless confined to a specific historical example, such as Marx's excellent analysis of the early reign of Emperor Napoleon III of France in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. By the end of Wahid's home theory, everything from my tone that was not anywhere near as strident as his, to Unitarian Universalist affiliation, to even private chat logs that I exposed only to report on harassment and hatred as part of a broader expose of Wahid once and for all, so no one is ever tricked into giving this asshat a platform like I was, is folded into a sweeping conspiracy of liberalism, sexual modernity, and lastly, everyone's favorite misunderstood word, Zionism. Use of theory does not account for this, or excuse me, use of the theory that does not account for this becomes a cudgel to silence dissent, rather than a scalpel to clarify complexity if simply restated, as Wahid does to pad his weak, mean-spirited, historically illiterate arguments, rather than examined critically. And thus his theory lies shattered at his feet, as history once again smashes narrative. That's why I started this channel, is to try to use actual history to bust narratives. Whether it's authoritarian narratives in the Baha'i faith, or fascistic narratives in America, or the narrative that you have to accept late stage capitalism in order to play video games. And so I implore you to, if you like this and want to hear more from me, subscribe and hit the bell. Doing this stuff for free is hard work that's emotionally draining sometimes, especially when dealing with personal attacks against me, which has rarely happened. But because most people who have criticized me have had good points, and I've been responsive to criticism. But at the same time, there is a limit, and I have to put my foot down. Because you and Wahid Azal are lumping all Jews and Jewish Israelis who do not reject Israel's right to exist entirely into one monolith. The same thing you accuse me of doing to Palestinians, when I, in fact, agree Israel is committing plausible genocide and separated Hamas's genocidal menace from the average Palestinian civilian. One way you did this was by dismissing my experience with losing a family member to terrorism on 9/11 and my sourcing of Yahya Sinwar's blase dismissal of civilian casualties with shrillness about, quote, pinkwashing, when I did nothing of the kind. Then you provide no practical solutions to the conflict, except presumably to let Hamas violently undo the existence of Israel from the river to the sea by justifying rape, kidnapping, and missile launches at civilians from civilian structures, I guess. This is reductionism on steroids, and in fact, what I'll coin the fallacy of grand narrative overreach. When every act is explained by the same master theory to support a predetermined position, thought stops and preaching begins. I guess I shouldn't expect anything different from a self-proclaimed inheritor of an entire desiccated and minuscule faith. In conclusion, the essay, The Incoherence of My Critics, by Wahid Azal, accuses me of collapsing debate into moral certainty, yet it does the exact same thing. Collapsing disagreement into racism, collapsing identity into manipulation, collapsing complexity into the same tortured theory he's tried to peddle to everyone who would listen, with no academics ever citing him, as Chris Bennett mentioned. For my entire lifetime, this so-called response to me is therefore nothing but the pseudo-esoteric, race-baiting, navel-gazing ramblings of a habitual drug user and cult leader, guilty of the many sins it claims to expose. It fetishizes the bayah as a mystical rupture, while mixing it with Marxism and South American drugs, but never explains how that works. And other posts purporting to do so have lacking foundation without bobbies around to confirm. As it engages in empty abstraction, paraded as profundity, it reduces liberalism to a cartoon villain, a straw man built for easy distortion, then drowns itself in jargon such as ontological rupture and hermeneutic sovereignty. These are words that obscure instead of illuminate, providing faux academic camouflage for a man who puffs himself up. While I have never claimed to be more than a history nerd and presenter on YouTube, with historian's instincts, the historian in me, as I put it to him in DMs, did not therefore claim any authority. It pretends to confront colonial violence by parodying theory, but then enacts its own type of violence by refusing to engage with anything, quote, Western. It romanticizes said Occidentalist refusal as resistance, but refusal alone is not liberation. Negation, such as of Israel's right to exist, and America's ideals, or of the value of criticizing infallible, supposedly divinely ordained assumptions, rationally without presenting positive alternatives, is just nihilism when I have criticized both America and Israel plenty. Nihilism that has made you, Wahid, angry enough to threaten harassment because you think nothing matters but your actual opportunism to engage in a performance of radicalism devoid of historical understanding. You made a parade of jargon, a fetish of refusal, a caricature of intellectual power, while being perpetually victimized by the boogeymen of the West, mistaking volume for validity, dogma for analysis, argument for or rather sermon for arguments. I put that wrong. See, I am not perfect. But anyway, like all sermons, it demands faith, not thought. This is what you have always demanded, and this is what I and my co-hosts will talk about today. Your history of having a dangerous and erratic temper is also why I took your threats to, quote, remove my channel by any means necessary seriously and panicked. In my anger, I misunderstood the scope of our podcast agreement and filed a copyright removal request on your copy of the video, after also roiling with anger that you did not respond to my request to take down the video on November 29th. That was a mistake, and I retracted it in response to a counter notification, which I decided on after doing more research on the law surrounding podcast guest releases. For that, I do apologize. But will you ever apologize for dragging my reputation through the mud and saying to me and you two that I claimed your video in bad faith? While you now have the ability to leech off my hard work and be a lazy boil on the side of my achievement forever? No, you will not. For that would require you to do the decent thing and take down the video yourself, for what I have good faith to believe is an infringing use of my trademark over the hidden faith and its logo. Then re-upload it and the thumbnail I made myself that you didn't bother to update when I sent you an updated one. Then re-upload it if you still wish to crib off of me, cropping everything but your face out. In fact, in your latest email, you, quote, reserve the right to respond however you like to, quote, so-called, quote, defamatory statements, misrepresentations, or further escalations, whether online or otherwise. While claiming I could still keep my copy of the video, well, duh, you have no legal leg to stand on to claim otherwise. And that you considered the matter closed when I retracted my claim. So which is it, you shitty asshole? To protect myself from now on, all future podcast guests will not be allowed to have access to the source files without written approval for a limited renewable amount of time, as well as tight restrictions on usage and promotion to prevent this kind of reputational damage happening again. The collaborator feature on YouTube will be sufficient and better enable podcast guests to claim rights to their image anyway, while reserving to myself the right of revocation of such ability for a guest channel to co-host the video through this process by me if they damage my reputation for any reason, unless in response to actual legal process and not the threat of it. As I said in my email responding to you, Wahid, I have plenty of other evidence of your malfeasance through the years towards me and others, and would consider any attempts to abuse reporting systems such as YouTube's copyright claim or other systems a legally servable escalation. You are a public figure. The laws of the United States, the District of Columbia would cover it if you tried anything further. And under U.S. law, any defamation claim would need to prove actual malice, which is not what motivated me to simply ask for more information to corroborate the one source you did provide about Baha'u'llah ordering murders of Azalis, and then criticize you when you responded with venom. False attempts to remove my channel for First Amendment protected speech when I have not been racist to you or anything once would likely result in the termination of your channel. By YouTube, not by me, by YouTube, because they would see for you for what you are, a false reporter. Minus the sexual harassment and adding senile ignorance at best of my pronouns. You're basically a broke, schizophrenic, drugged out Iranian Australian version of Justin Baldoni. See, this is a reference to who you are so people do not assume you white like Justin Baldoni, not an homonym. And this video is the first time I've ever mentioned it, so don't hide behind it ever again. Just like Baldoni, you initially presented yourself as a fighter for justice, but turned on on your collaborator the moment he didn't smile and nod and go along with everything you said. So your crazy ramblings at least likely won't lead to lawsuits, despite empty legal threats and harassment being a favorite of yours for decades.